In March of 1983, a wedding photographer in Nova Scotia developed a roll of film and discovered something in the background that made him vomit into his darkroom sink. A woman watching from the tree line. Her face wasn't just unusual, it was genetically impossible. And 2 days later, she left him a photograph of 30 children who all looked exactly like her, with a message written in blood. Before we dive into this story, I need you to understand something. What you're about to hear isn't folklore or urban legend. This is inspired by documented history that will challenge change, what you may have thought about how far human isolation can go. If stories like this matter to you, click the like button and subscribe to the channel so we can continue bringing you stories that most people are too afraid to tell. Also, I'd love you to leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, because this story needs witnesses. Now let's continue with the story. Vincent had photographed hundreds of weddings across Nova Scotia, capturing moments of joy that families would treasure for generations. He prided himself on his attention to detail, on noticing the small things that made each celebration unique. But nothing in his 15 years behind the camera had prepared him for the woman who appeared in frame after frame of the Hartley wedding, always watching from a distance, never approaching the celebration. She wore a dress that looked decades out of fashion. The blue fabric faded to an indeterminate gray. In every shot, she stood at the edge of the property, partially obscured by trees, her posture suggesting she wanted to be seen and hidden simultaneously. Vincent had noticed her during the wedding, assuming she was a shy relative, perhaps someone with social anxiety who preferred to observe rather than participate. It was only when he developed the film that he saw her face clearly. The enlargement process revealed details his naked eye had missed in the chaos of the event. Her skin possessed an almost translucent quality, pale to the point of seeming bloodless. The bone structure of her face followed lines that seemed fundamentally wrong, as if the architecture of her skull had been designed according to blueprints that deviated from human norms. Her forehead protruded prominently, while her chin receded so dramatically it barely existed. The eyes, those pale blue eyes the color of ice on a winter lake, were positioned wider than any face Vincent had ever photographed. But it was her hands that disturbed him most profoundly. In one close-up shot where she had raised her arm, perhaps to shield her face from the camera, he could see clear webbing between her ring finger and pinky, the translucent skin connecting the digits halfway to the first knuckle. Vincent called the bride's mother, a woman named Patricia Hartley, who had commissioned the photography. He described the woman in blue, asking if she was a relative who might want copies of the photographs. Patricia's confusion was immediate and genuine. She knew every guest at her daughter's wedding. She had personally approved the invitation list. Nobody matching Vincent's description had been invited, and certainly nobody had appeared who looked the way he was describing. Vincent hung up the phone and returned to his dark room, spreading the photographs across his workspace. The woman appeared in 17 different shots, always at a distance, always watching. He was about to file the images away, dismiss them as a strange coincidence, when his mail slot rattled. An unmarked envelope lay on his studio floor. No postage, no return address, hand-delivered by someone who had come and gone without ringing the bell. Inside, Vincent found a single photograph, badly damaged by age and water, the edges curled and discolored. The image showed approximately 30 children standing in front of ramshackle wooden structures built into a mountainside. Every child in the photograph had the same pale blue eyes. Every face showed the same distinctive bone structure, the same translucent skin, the same subtle wrongness that marked them as something other than typical children. and standing in the front row, no more than 7 or 8 years old, was the woman from the wedding. Vincent turned the photograph over. On the back, written in handwriting that shook with urgency, were 5 words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "We are still here. South Mountain. Please." His hands trembling, Vincent reached for the phone. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police needed to see this, because if these children were still on South Mountain, still living in those structures, still producing generation after generation with those same features, then something unthinkable was happening just miles from Wolfville. Something that official records claimed had ended over a decade ago. Something that, according to every government file, should no longer exist. The RCMP officer who answered Vincent's call introduced himself as Constable Gerald Ouellet. His voice carried the weary professionalism of someone who had spent decades sorting genuine emergencies from paranoid fantasies. That weariness evaporated the moment Vincent mentioned South Mountain and described the photograph. 20 minutes later, Ouellet sat across from Vincent in the studio, the damaged photograph laid between them on the desk. The constable's face had gone pale. He pulled a thick manila folder from his briefcase, the tab marked in faded red ink. Goler investigation. Closed 1972. The file opened to reveal photographs that made Vincent's stomach clench. Dozens of images documenting what appeared to be a massive family, all sharing those same distinctive features he'd seen in the woman at the wedding. But these photos were official police documentation, complete with evidence markers and case numbers. Ouellet's finger traced the timeline documented in the reports. In November of 1972, authorities had raided a compound on South Mountain after receiving multiple reports of child neglect. What they found defied comprehension. 3 elderly adults living among the ruins of what had clearly been a much-worried settlement. The structures showed evidence of recent occupation by dozens of people who had vanished. The medical examiner's notes, written in precise clinical language, described the 3 remaining Golers in terms that sounded more appropriate for a genetics textbook than a police report. Severe maxillary hypoplasia, bilateral syndactyly, cranial malformations consistent with repeated consanguineous relationships across multiple generations. The doctor's conclusion, underlined twice in the original document, stated that the physical abnormalities suggested inbreeding so extreme it had persisted for at least 4 or 5 generations. 1 week after the raid, the main compound structure burned to the ground. The 3 elderly Golers died in the blaze. Fire investigators ruled it accidental, caused by a faulty wood stove. The case was closed with the assumption that the rest of the family had scattered across Canada or slipped into the United States. Nobody followed up. Nobody verified where approximately 30 to 40 individuals had actually gone. Ouellet leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. He'd been a young officer in 1972, not yet assigned to major investigations. But he remembered the fire, remembered the whispered conversations among senior officers who seemed relieved the case had resolved itself so conveniently. Vincent pointed to the photograph he'd received, the one showing the woman as a child. If she had been 7 or 8 years old when that picture was taken, and she appeared to be in her late teens or early 20s at the wedding, then the timeline suggested something impossible. The photograph couldn't have been taken before the 1972 fire. It had to be more recent, unless the family had never actually left. Ouellet pulled out additional documents from the file. Property records showed the Goler family had originally purchased 200 acres in 1934. But a land survey from 1968, conducted just 4 years before the fire, revealed something peculiar. The property boundaries had mysteriously expanded to nearly 800 acres through a series of complicated transfers involving shell companies and signatures from individuals who, according to death certificates, had been deceased when they supposedly signed the documents. The constable spread a topographical map across the desk. The official Goler property, that had been raided in '72, occupied the southern slope of the mountain, easily accessible from the main valley road. But the expanded territory, the additional 600 acres acquired through those questionable transfers, extended deep into the mountain's northern wilderness, into terrain so remote and difficult that most locals considered it effectively impassable. If someone wanted to disappear, to create a hidden settlement that existed off every official map, that northern territory would be perfect. And if the family had been planning for years to stage their own extinction, sacrificing 3 elderly members in a fire, while the rest retreated to a pre-prepared location, they could have been living there for over a decade, while the world believed they had ceased to exist. Goler closed the file and met Vincent's eyes. The woman at the wedding wasn't a ghost from the past. She was evidence that somewhere in those mountains, the Goler family was still breeding, still isolating themselves, still producing generation after generation with those same devastating genetic markers. They had faked their own death, and if Vincent's photograph was any indication, what was happening in that hidden compound had only gotten worse. Violates' investigation led him to a house on the outskirts of Wolfville, where Margaret Finch lived alone, surrounded by the archived remains of her mother's medical practice. Dr. Eleanor Finch had been the region's country doctor for 26 years until her death in 1981. What her daughter had discovered in the attic 2 years later had been disturbing enough that she'd kept it locked away, unsure what to do with journals that documented something she couldn't quite believe. Margaret led Willay and Vincent through rooms stacked with boxes of medical files, old equipment, and personal effects she'd never had the heart to sort through. In the attic, beneath a tarp covered in dust, sat 3 leather-bound journals marked with years spanning from 1955 to 1972. The first entries about the Goler family appeared in August of 1959. Dr. Finch had been summoned to treat a child with a severe respiratory infection. Her notes described the journey, a drive that ended where the mountain road became impassable, followed by a blindfolded walk for what she estimated was another mile. When the blindfold came off, she found herself in a clearing with several wooden structures and approximately 20 people watching her with identical pale eyes. The child she treated, a boy of perhaps 6 years old, had club feet that had never been corrected. Dr. Finch noted this was a treatable condition if addressed in infancy, but the family had never sought medical care. She also documented something else that caught her attention. Every person in that clearing shared remarkably similar facial features: prominent foreheads, recessed chins, ears set unusually low on their heads. At the time, she attributed it to strong family genetics. The journal entries became more frequent and more disturbing over the following decade. In 1962, Dr. Finch treated a girl with a cleft palate so severe she could barely eat. In '64, she delivered twins, who both had fused fingers on their left hands. By '67, her medical observations had shifted from clinical documentation to growing alarm. Her handwriting grew more agitated as the years progressed. She described examining siblings who displayed identical rare deformities, suggesting they had inherited the same recessive genes from both parents. She documented multiple children with microcephaly, their heads measuring significantly smaller than normal development would allow. She treated teenagers with bone abnormalities she'd only seen in textbooks on genetic disorders. The entry from March of 1970 detailed her examination of two young girls, supposedly 14 and 12 years old, though their physical development suggested they might be even younger. Both were pregnant. Both had the same severe maxillary hypoplasia, their upper jaws so underdeveloped they struggled to close their mouths properly. When Dr. Finch asked about the fathers of their unborn children, the family matriarch had simply smiled and said, "Family takes care of family." Dr. Finch's final entry about the Golers, dated October of 1972, just weeks before the fire, carried an entirely different tone. Her handwriting was rushed, almost panicked. "They know I've been keeping records. I saw the way Caleb Goler looked at my medical bag today when I was called to treat a boy with a broken arm. He asked what I write in my journals, whether I share my observations with other doctors. I told him they were private medical notes, but he didn't believe me. I could see it in those colorless eyes. They've stopped calling for me. No more summons to the mountain. I fear what this means for those children. Without even minimal medical intervention, some of them won't survive. But I'm more afraid of what might happen if I report what I've documented. These people have lived in isolation for generations. They follow their own rules, and I suspect those rules include dealing with threats to their secrecy. God help those children, because I cannot." 1 month after that entry, the compound burned. Dr. Finch never wrote about the Golers again. She died 9 years later, taking her suspicions to the grave. But her journals remained. And now, reading her detailed observations, Goler understood they weren't dealing with simple neglect or accidental inbreeding. The Goler family had been systematically breeding themselves into genetic collapse for decades. And if they'd been continuing the practice for another 11 years in their hidden compound, the current generation might be facing genetic damage beyond anything Dr. Finch had documented. The physical abnormalities she'd observed in the 1960s and 70s would be magnified, concentrated, expressed in ways that might make those earlier cases seem mild by comparison. The question wasn't whether they should find this hidden compound. The question was what they would discover when they did. Thomas, 14, answered his door on a Tuesday morning to find two men holding a photograph that dragged him back to the worst day of his professional life. At 73, the retired surveyor had spent 16 years trying to forget what he'd seen in the South Mountain wilderness. The moment he looked at the image Vincent had received, those pale blue eyes staring from the damaged photograph, every detail came flooding back with crystalline clarity. In June of 1967, Fortin had been hired by a Halifax law firm to survey the disputed property boundaries in the mountain region. The assignment seemed routine until he got lost in forest so dense the canopy blocked out the midday sun. He'd been wandering for nearly 2 hours when he heard voices and followed them, hoping to find someone who could point him toward the access road. The clearing opened before him without warning. 30 people stood in organized rows, facing an elderly man whose voice carried across the space with religious fervor. 14 froze at the tree line, instinctively knowing he was witnessing something he shouldn't see. What struck him immediately, what made his surveyor's eye for detail go into overdrive, was how similar they all looked. Not just family resemblance, but something far more profound. Every face shared the same architectural blueprint. The children especially looked like variations on a single template, as if someone had taken one child and created 30 copies, with only minor modifications. Their skin had an almost luminescent quality in the dappled sunlight, pale to the point where he could see the blue tracery of veins beneath the surface. The eyes, uniformly that washed-out blue, were set wider apart than normal human spacing allowed. Several children had visible deformities. One boy's hands were twisted into claws, fingers fused together in ways that made Fortin think of birth defects he'd seen in livestock when breeding populations became too isolated. But what made his blood run cold was the pregnant girls. 4 teenage girls, none looking older than 15, stood in the front row with swollen bellies that indicated they were far along in their pregnancies. All 4 had facial structures that suggested severe developmental problems. Their jaws protruded at odd angles, their foreheads bulged prominently, and when one of them smiled at something the elderly man said, Fortin saw teeth growing in chaotic patterns, overlapping and twisted. He tried to back away silently, but his boot caught a dead branch. The crack echoed through the clearing like a gunshot. 30 heads turned in perfect unison to stare at him. Within seconds, 5 men surrounded him, rifles pointed at his chest. They moved with coordinated precision that suggested they'd practiced this response many times. The elderly man approached, and Fortin found himself staring into eyes so pale they were almost colorless, like ice that had been frozen and refrozen until all impurities had been squeezed out. The man's face displayed the same structural abnormalities as the children, but weathered by age into something that looked barely human. His chin receded so dramatically it merged almost directly into his neck. His forehead protruded in a heavy ridge that shadowed his eyes. When he spoke, his voice carried a genteel courtesy that made the threat underneath even more terrifying. "You're lost, surveyor. These mountains are dangerous for people who wander where they shouldn't. Family business is family business. Outsiders who can't mind their own affairs sometimes get lost in these woods permanently. We wouldn't want that to happen to you." 2 men blindfolded Fortin and led him through the forest for what felt like hours, though his internal compass told him they were deliberately taking a circuitous route to disorient him. When they finally removed the blindfold, he stood on a road he recognized, miles from where he'd entered the forest. He never filed a report about what he'd seen, never told his employer about the compound. The veiled threat had been clear enough, and Fortin had a wife and 2 young daughters at home. He marked the disputed area as inaccessible terrain in his official survey, and convinced himself that what happened in isolated mountain families wasn't his concern. But he'd known what he was looking at. Those children weren't the product of cousins marrying cousins over a few generations. The uniformity of their features, the concentration of genetic abnormalities, suggested something far more extreme. Brothers and sisters, parents and children. Generation after generation of the closest possible biological relationships, creating a population that was collapsing under the weight of its own genetic isolation. And now, 16 years later, sitting in his living room with these 2 investigators, Fortin realized his silence had allowed it to continue. Those pregnant teenage girls he'd seen in '67 would have given birth to children even more damaged than themselves. Those children would now be teenagers, potentially pregnant with the next generation. The nightmare hadn't ended with the '72 fire. It had simply moved deeper into the mountains, continuing in darkness. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While Goler worked through official channels requesting search warrants and assembling an investigative team, Vincent continued his own inquiries. A casual conversation with a local historian led him to a safety deposit box registered under the name Mountain Heritage Holdings, a shell company that had been dormant since 1973. The bank manager in Halifax initially refused access until Goler arrived with a court order. What they found inside transformed the investigation from suspected abuse to documented genetic engineering. 3 leather-bound ledgers, their pages yellowed with age, contained meticulous genealogical records dating back to 1934, but these weren't ordinary family trees tracking marriages and births. Each entry included detailed physical descriptions, with certain characteristics marked by hand-drawn stars. Pale blue eyes, prominent brow ridges, recessed chins, and even specific deformities, like fused digits or unusually shaped skulls. The first patriarch, Jeremiah Goler, had begun the practice. His initial entries showed marriages between his 8 children, in combinations that made Vincent's stomach turn. Brothers married to sisters. But the notations suggested this wasn't accidental or circumstantial. Next to each pairing, Jeremiah had written observations about their offspring, tracking which combinations produced children with the most pronounced, pure characteristics. By the second generation, the pattern became deliberate and systematic. Uncles were paired with nieces specifically because their first child had displayed particularly pale eyes. Fathers bred with daughters when the council determined it would intensify the bloodline. The ledgers tracked these relationships with the cold precision of livestock breeding records. What made the documents truly horrifying was the language. Physical abnormalities that any medical professional would recognize as warning signs of genetic collapse were described as marks of divine favor or blessings of purity. A child born with fused fingers wasn't disabled, according to the careful handwriting, but doubly blessed with the mark. Severe intellectual disabilities were reframed as pure spirits uncorrupted by worldly intelligence. The most recent entries, dated from 1982 and 83, showed the current generation. The genetic relationships had become so tangled that traditional family terms ceased to function. One teenage girl listed in the ledger was simultaneously the daughter, granddaughter, and niece of the same man, through multiple lines of descent. Her genetic diversity had been so thoroughly eliminated that she was, for all practical purposes, as related to both her parents as if she were their identical twin. A separate section of the ledger documented what they called correction assignments. Children who displayed too few of the desired characteristics, or who showed deformities deemed unacceptable by the council, were designated for labor duties and excluded from breeding selection. The notations suggested a hierarchy where the most severely inbred individuals, those displaying the most extreme concentration of genetic markers, occupied positions of honor. Ouellette photographed every page, while a geneticist he'd consulted by phone grew increasingly agitated on the speaker. Dr. James Rothstein from McGill University had initially been skeptical of the case details, but listening to the genealogical data being read aloud changed his assessment entirely. What you're describing represents one of the most extreme documented cases of human inbreeding in modern history. Rothstein's voice crackled through the phone. 7 generations of systematic incest with zero introduction of outside genetic material. The coefficient of inbreeding in your youngest generation would exceed anything outside of laboratory settings. You're looking at individuals who have lost roughly 90% of their genetic diversity. He paused, and when he spoke again, his clinical detachment had vanished. The children in that compound aren't just at risk of genetic disorders. Based on what you're telling me, many of them are probably already suffering from multiple simultaneous conditions. The physical deformities your witnesses described are just the visible manifestations. Internally, their organs, their metabolic systems, their neurological development, all of it has been compromised by generations of concentrated inbreeding. Vincent watched Ouellet's face go pale as Rothstein continued. Some of those children may not survive into their 20s, even with medical intervention. And the ones being born now, to parents who are themselves the product of 6 or 7 generations of incest. Those infants are facing genetic catastrophes that most doctors will never see in their entire careers. The ledgers had documented everything. Every deliberate pairing designed to concentrate genetic markers. Every child assessed and ranked by how many abnormalities they displayed. 50 years of systematic breeding that treated human beings as livestock, justified by religious rhetoric about purity and divine favor. The family hadn't just practiced inbreeding. They had engineered their own genetic extinction and called it salvation. Sarah Brennan had spent 12 years tracking wildlife populations through the Nova Scotia wilderness, documenting migration patterns and genetic diversity in isolated animal communities. When the RCMP contacted her about using her wilderness expertise to locate a hidden human settlement, she assumed it would be a straightforward tracking job. Nothing in her professional experience prepared her for what she observed through high-powered optics over 7 days in August of 1983. The compound occupied a valley invisible from any access point, ringed by dense forest, and accessible only through a narrow ravine that would be impassable during winter. A dozen structures of varying sizes spread across the clearing, some partially built into the hillside, others constructed from salvaged materials that had weathered into the surrounding landscape. Smoke rose from several chimneys, even in the summer heat, suggesting inadequate ventilation required constant fires for cooking. On the third morning of surveillance, the entire population emerged for what appeared to be a dawn gathering. Sarah adjusted her binoculars and began counting. 62 individuals, ranging from infants carried in arms to elderly members who moved with difficulty. As the sun rose higher, illuminating the clearing, she got her first clear look at their faces, her field. Journal entry from that morning, later submitted as evidence, described her reaction in clinical terms that barely masked her horror. Every person in that clearing displayed obvious physical manifestations of severe inbreeding. The genetic markers weren't subtle variations, but pronounced abnormalities that appeared across the entire population with disturbing consistency. The children showed the most extreme effects. Their heads had unusual shapes, some with foreheads that bulged dramatically, others with skulls that appeared compressed or elongated. Eyes uniformly pale blue, set so widely apart that several children's faces had an almost alien quality. Many walked with pronounced limps, their legs bowed or twisted. Several had arms that hung at odd angles, suggesting malformed joints or fused bones that restricted movement. Through her telephoto lens, Sarah documented specific cases that would later become part of the medical record. A boy of perhaps 10, whose hands were so deformed his fingers curved back on themselves, making it impossible for him to grasp objects properly. Twin girls, identifiable by matching dresses, who both had the same severe facial asymmetry. One side of their faces developed normally, while the other seemed frozen in an earlier stage of growth. An infant with a head so misshapen, it was remarkable the child had survived birth. What disturbed her most was the organization. The children moved in assigned groups based on age and physical capability. Those with the most severe disabilities were kept together in a separate structure, brought out only for the morning gathering and what appeared to be supervised work details. Even from a distance, Sarah could see these children struggled with basic tasks, their cognitive impairments as obvious as their physical deformities. On the 5th day, she witnessed something that made her radio immediately for Uele. A ceremony in the clearing where teenage girls, several barely able to walk without assistance, were led to stand beside adult male relatives. An elderly man with a white beard moved down the line, placing his hands on each girl's head, while the assembled family watched in silence. The girls ranged from perhaps 13 to 16, and at least 3 were visibly pregnant, despite their obvious developmental disabilities and physical impairments. Sarah had studied isolated animal populations where inbreeding had caused genetic collapse. She'd documented the physical deformities that appeared in mountain lion populations cut off from genetic exchange, the cognitive impairments in island fox communities, the cascading health problems that emerged when genetic diversity dropped below sustainable levels. She understood intellectually what happened when populations bred themselves into genetic corners with no way out. But watching it happen to humans, seeing children who had been deliberately bred into disability, observing a community that had systematically destroyed its own genetic viability while believing they were achieving purity, created a kind of existential horror that her scientific training couldn't process. These weren't people living in ignorance of genetics. The ledgers Goler had described proved they'd been tracking bloodlines and arranging pairings for 50 years. They knew what they were doing. They'd watched children born with increasingly severe abnormalities and responded not by seeking outside genetic material, but by breeding even closer relatives, believing the deformities were divine blessings rather than biological warnings. Sarah packed up her surveillance equipment and hiked back to the staging area, where Goler waited. Her report would provide the detailed intelligence needed for the rescue operation. But nothing in it would adequately convey what it felt like to watch an entire population marching willingly toward genetic extinction, celebrating the physical evidence of their own destruction. The woman who collapsed outside the Halifax Women's Shelter on October 12, 1983, had walked 73 miles through wilderness terrain over 3 days. Her feet were bloodied, her clothing torn, and her appearance immediately triggered a call to the RCMP before the shelter staff even learned her name. She had the Goler features, the translucent pale skin, the wide-set ice blue eyes, the facial structure that marked her as part of the family Violates had been hunting for months. But she also had a pronounced limp from a clubfoot that had never been treated, and when she extended her hands to accept water, the staff saw webbing between several of her fingers. Her name was Miriam Goler. She was 19 years old, though malnutrition made her appear much younger. Medical examination revealed she'd given birth at least twice, possibly 3 times. Her teeth were rotting from years without dental care. She had scars across her back consistent with repeated beatings, and she carried information that would break the case open. Goler arrived within hours. Miriam's story poured out in a torrent of words that sometimes made sense, and sometimes dissolved into religious phrases that took him hours to decode. She'd been born in the hidden compound, one of 17 children, produced by a father who was simultaneously her grandfather through 3 different lines of descent. Her mother had died giving birth to her youngest brother, a baby born with deformities so severe he'd lived only 6 hours. That death had meant nothing to the Council of Elders. Deaths were common, expected, explained away as God calling the impure home. What mattered was that Miriam's father needed a new breeding partner, and the council had determined she would serve that purpose. At 19, she would marry her own father and begin producing the next generation. Something inside her had broken at that announcement. She described it as a clarity that cut through years of conditioning, like a knife through cloth. She suddenly saw the other young women in the compound not as blessed members of God's chosen bloodline, but as prisoners being used to breed children who were born suffering. Her escape had been desperate and unplanned. During a work detail near the compound's eastern boundary, she'd simply started walking. No supplies, no plan, just the overwhelming need to get away before the marriage ceremony that was scheduled for the following week. She'd followed streams downhill, reasoning they would eventually lead to civilization, eating berries and drinking water that made her violently ill but kept her moving. What she told Goler about life inside the compound confirmed everything the surveillance had suggested and added layers of horror that no outside observer could have documented. The Council of Elders, 4 men all over 60, and all products of multiple generations of inbreeding themselves, controlled every aspect of community life. They decided who married whom based on genealogical records they maintained with religious fervor. They assigned children to work groups based on their level of physical and mental capability. They determined which babies born with severe defects would be allowed to survive and which would be left to die from neglect. Most devastatingly, they'd convinced the entire population that their distinctive features were marks of divine favor. Children born with fused fingers were called doubly blessed. Those with misshapen skulls were said to have room for greater spiritual wisdom. Severe intellectual disabilities meant a child had been granted purity of spirit, uncorrupted by worldly knowledge. Every genetic disaster was reframed as a blessing. Miriam described the indoctrination that began in earliest childhood. The elders taught that in 1972, God had destroyed the outside world in righteous fire. The compound survivors were the last humans on Earth, tasked with preserving humanity through careful bloodline management. The pale eyes, the distinctive bone structure, even the deformities were proof they'd been chosen for this sacred duty. Mixing with outsiders, if any still existed, would corrupt the purity they'd spent generations achieving. The teenage girls being prepared for breeding assignments genuinely believed they were fulfilling divine purpose. The men who bred with their daughters, sisters, and nieces saw themselves as righteous patriarchs following God's plan. The cycle continued because everyone involved had been convinced that what they were doing was not just acceptable, but holy. Miriam's voice dropped to a whisper as she described watching her infant brother die. His head had been grotesquely enlarged, fluid building up because his skull hadn't formed properly. He'd screamed for 6 hours before falling silent. The elders had called his death a mercy, said God had taken him because he was too pure for this world. That's when she'd known with absolute certainty that they weren't blessed. They were dying. One generation at a time, breeding themselves into extinction while calling it salvation. And now, she was out. But 61 others remained inside, including children being groomed for breeding assignments that would produce an 8th generation even more damaged than the 7th. Goler picked up his radio. It was time to bring them out. Dr. James Rothstein arrived in Halifax 3 days before the planned rescue operation, carrying a briefcase full of projections that made even seasoned officers uncomfortable. The geneticist had spent 2 weeks analyzing the genealogical ledgers, creating a comprehensive map of the family's genetic collapse that illustrated exactly what the rescue teams would encounter. His presentation to the assembled law enforcement and medical personnel began with a single statistic that silenced the room. The youngest generation of Golers had an average coefficient of inbreeding of 0.4375. To put that in perspective, laboratory mice bred specifically for genetic uniformity typically registered around 0.3, The Goler children were more inbred than experimental animals. Rothstein's genetic map covered an entire wall, a web of lines connecting the same names over and over across 7 generations. But it wasn't the complexity that disturbed his audience. It was the simplicity. By the 7th generation, there were so few distinct genetic lines that the family tree had essentially collapsed into a narrow column. Most of the youngest children could trace their ancestry back to the same 4 individuals through 8 or 9 different pathways. The medical projections painted a grim picture. Based on the coefficient of inbreeding and the known genetic markers documented in the ledgers, Rothstein predicted they would find numerous cases of severe intellectual disability, ranging from mild learning difficulties to profound cognitive impairment requiring lifelong institutional care. The physical manifestations would likely include skeletal deformities, affecting mobility and causing chronic pain, craniofacial abnormalities ranging from cleft palates to severely misshapen skulls, digit malformations, including both extra fingers and fused digits, vision impairment up to and including complete blindness from genetic eye conditions, hearing loss or total deafness from malformed auditory structures, and metabolic disorders that could prove life-threatening without immediate medical intervention. But Rothstein's most disturbing prediction involved conditions so rare that most doctors would never encounter them in decades of practice. When someone inherits the same extremely rare recessive gene from both parents, disorders manifest that exist in medical literature, but rarely in living patients. With the Goler family's level of inbreeding, these impossibly rare conditions became statistical certainties. He displayed photographs from medical textbooks showing genetic disorders that required both parents to carry genes so uncommon that normal population genetics made them virtually impossible. Except in populations where everyone was so closely related that rare genes appeared in every individual, making inheritance from both sides guaranteed rather than unlikely. The medical team assembled for the rescue operation included specialists in genetic disorders, pediatric emergency medicine, and psychological trauma. They were briefed on what to expect, warned not to show visible shock when encountering individuals whose appearance might be profoundly disturbing, and trained to handle patients who had been conditioned to view medical intervention as an attack on their divine purity. Goler added a complication that made the operation even more delicate. According to Miriam, the elders had discussed contingency plans for what they called the final test. If outsiders ever discovered the compound, if the family faced separation or forced integration into what they believed was a destroyed world, the council had debated whether mass suicide would be preferable to corruption. Miriam wasn't certain if they'd actually follow through, but the possibility meant the rescue had to happen simultaneously across the entire compound, preventing the elders from gathering the community in one location. The timeline was equally critical. Winter would make the ravine access impossible within 6 weeks. If they waited, the compound would be unreachable until spring, meaning another 6 months for the pregnant teenagers to give birth to an 8th generation. Another 6 months for more children to die from untreated genetic conditions. Another 6 months for the breeding program to continue its systematic destruction of human genetic diversity. The operation was scheduled for November 8, 1983. 43 officers from multiple jurisdictions would converge on the compound from 3 directions at dawn. Medical teams would be standing by to begin triage immediately. Miriam would return with them, the one voice that might be able to penetrate the conditioning and prevent the elders from convincing the community that demons had come to destroy them. Rothstein closed his presentation with a statement that would prove prophetic. What we're about to encounter isn't just a rescue operation. It's a genetic emergency. Some of those children may already be beyond what modern medicine can repair. We're not just saving them from abuse. We're trying to save them from the biological consequences of 50 years of deliberate genetic destruction, and I'm not certain we'll succeed. The room remained silent long after he finished speaking. Dawn broke over South Mountain on November 8th, with a cold clarity that made visibility perfect and the operation unavoidable. 3 teams moved through the ravine simultaneously, converging on the compound from positions Sarah Brennan had mapped during her surveillance. The officers had been briefed extensively, shown photographs, prepared for what they would encounter. None of it mattered when they actually saw the Golers face to face. The family emerged from their structures as the officers entered the clearing, and for a moment everyone simply stared at each other across 50 feet of open ground. 62 individuals, who looked like they'd stepped out of a genetic horror, stood motionless, their faces showing confusion rather than fear. Many had never seen outsiders before. Several of the younger children genuinely appeared to believe the officers might be supernatural entities, either demons come to test their faith or angels heralding the end times their elders had promised. The medical team began immediate triage as officers separated the adults from the children to prevent the elders from issuing orders. What they documented in those first frantic hours exceeded even Rothstein's grim predictions. Of the 62 people extracted, 53 displayed obvious physical manifestations of inbreeding that ranged from merely noticeable to profoundly disabling. The children showed the most catastrophic damage. A 6-year-old boy had a skull so misshapen his brain had been unable to develop properly, leaving him with the cognitive function of an infant. Twin girls, age 4, both had eyes positioned so far apart that they lacked binocular vision, their brains unable to process depth perception. A teenage boy's spine had formed with such severe curvature he stood perpetually bent, his internal organs compressed by the malformed bone structure. But it was the cases Rothstein had predicted, the impossibly rare genetic conditions, that left the medical team shaken. A 9-year-old girl had a metabolic disorder so uncommon that only 17 cases existed in global medical literature. Her body couldn't process certain proteins, leading to a buildup of toxins that had been slowly poisoning her for years. Without immediate treatment, she had perhaps 6 months to live. The condition required both parents to carry an extremely rare recessive gene. In a normal population, the odds of 2 carriers meeting and having children were astronomical. In the Goler compound, where everyone carried the same narrow band of genetics, it was inevitable. 3 infants showed signs of conditions that shouldn't exist outside of medical textbooks. One had a heart malformation so rare that the pediatric cardiologist had never seen an actual case, only studied theoretical examples in medical school. Another had a bone disorder that caused his skeleton to form improperly, every joint painful and unstable. These weren't conditions that developed from single genetic mutations. They required inheritance of the same rare defect from both mother and father, something that only happened when those parents were themselves products of multiple generations of incest. The pregnant teenagers presented their own emergency. Ultrasounds performed in the field revealed that several of the developing fetuses had severe abnormalities, incompatible with life outside the womb. One girl, barely 15, and unable to understand why the medical team seemed distressed, carried twins that appeared to have partially fused during development, a condition called conjoined twinning that occurred when genetic signals for separation failed during early embryonic development. As the extraction continued, the full scope of the hierarchy Miriam had described became visible. The most severely disabled individuals, those with profound cognitive impairments or multiple physical deformities, were kept in separate structures and had clearly been used for manual labor despite their conditions. Several had untreated injuries that had healed incorrectly, suggesting they'd been worked until they broke and then simply left to heal without medical care. The elders initially tried to maintain control by declaring the rescue an attack by Satan's servants. But when Miriam stepped into the clearing and shouted that the outside world still existed, that they'd been lied to about the 1972 apocalypse, that the features they'd been taught to celebrate as blessings were actually killing them, several of the young women began to weep. One girl, perhaps 17, looked at Miriam with eyes that suddenly held comprehension instead of emptiness. She touched her own misshapen face, then looked at the officers surrounding them, seeing for the first time that normal human faces didn't look like hers. She whispered something that was caught by nearby microphones and would later be played at trial. "We're not blessed. We're broken." That single moment of clarity spread through the gathered children like a wave, breaking the conditioning that had held them for generations. The genetic catastrophe was being extracted from the mountain, brought into light that would reveal both its full horror and, perhaps, offer some hope for survival. The trials began in December of 1984, 13 months after the rescue operation that had shocked the nation. 8 members of the Council of Elders faced charges ranging from child endangerment to sexual assault to conspiracy in the 1972 deaths that had faked the family's extinction. The prosecution presented the leather-bound ledgers as evidence of systematic genetic engineering that had deliberately bred children into disability. What made the courtroom proceedings surreal was the defendant's complete lack of remorse. The eldest council member, Caleb Goler, testified that every pairing documented in those ledgers had been divinely ordained. When prosecutors showed photographs of children with severe deformities, he called them marked by God's favor. When medical experts testified about genetic catastrophes and shortened lifespans, he responded that the pure in spirit are called home, early to sit at the right hand of the Lord. The defense attempted to argue that the elders were themselves victims of generational conditioning, raised in isolation with no understanding that their practices constituted crimes. But the ledgers undermined that argument. The meticulous record-keeping, the deliberate pairing decisions, the tracking of genetic markers across generations proved this wasn't ignorance. It was systematic, calculated, maintained with full awareness across 50 years. The most powerful testimony came from survivors who had worked with therapists to break through their conditioning. Miriam took the stand and described daily life in the compound with devastating clarity. She explained how children were taught that their deformities were blessings, how breeding assignments began at puberty, how anyone who questioned the system faced isolation in underground chambers until they submitted or died. A young man named Daniel, 23 years old, with severe club feet that left him in constant pain, testified about watching his sister give birth to a baby whose head was so malformed it couldn't survive. The elders had called it too pure for this world and buried the infant without ceremony. Daniel had been 13 at the time. That death had planted a seed of doubt that grew over the next decade into the certainty that what they called purity was actually extinction. The jury deliberated for 6 days. When they returned, they found all 8 council members guilty on multiple counts. Caleb Goler received life imprisonment without possibility of parole. The others received sentences ranging from 20 to 35 years, As they were led from the courtroom, Caleb turned to face the gallery, where several survivors sat, and spoke his final public words. "You have condemned the righteous and celebrated corruption, but our bloodline remains pure. The marks cannot be erased. You will see." The statement haunted those who heard it, because in a terrible way, he was right. The genetic damage couldn't be undone. The youngest survivors carried DNA so compromised by generations of inbreeding that many would face lifelong health complications. 3 children died within the first year, despite intensive medical care, their conditions too advanced for intervention to matter. Several more required multiple surgeries to address skeletal malformations and organ problems, but others survived. Miriam married a man from outside the family and gave birth to a healthy daughter whose genetic diversity had been restored in a single generation. Her daughter's face showed none of the Goler features, no pale eyes or misshapen bone structure, proof that the damage could be stopped, if not reversed. 10 years after the rescue, a documentary filmmaker tracked down survivors who agreed to share their stories. 23 of the original 62 were thriving, living independently, holding jobs, building families. 18 more were surviving with significant medical support. The rest had either died or required full-time institutional care. Miriam's reflection in that documentary became the defining statement about the Goler case. She looked directly into the camera and spoke with the clarity of someone who had walked through hell and emerged on the other side. They told us our differences made us special, that God marked us through our appearance. But those marks weren't blessings. They were warnings. We weren't being purified. We were dying, one generation at a time, celebrating our own extinction. I didn't destroy my family when I brought the authorities to that mountain. There was nothing left to destroy. I opened the cell door for prisoners who didn't know they were imprisoned. The screen faded to black on her face, on those pale blue eyes that would always mark her as a Goler, but now looked out at a world she had saved 61 others from never seeing. If this story touched you the way it touched me, click that like button, because stories this important need to be told, and subscribe to this channel, because we're not done exposing the darkness that hides in plain sight. These weren't monsters. They were human beings convinced that destroying themselves genetically was divine purpose. That might be the most terrifying part of all. Before you go ahead and drop a comment about what shocked you most. And remember that somewhere out there, isolation still creates conditions for nightmares like this to continue. Stay aware, stay vigilant, and we'll see you in the next story.